Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I am Bill Fenimore, and I'm pleased to be here today and share with you a little bit about the reasons why I love Utah and especially its wildlife diversity. The environment's a major topic of discussion today, and the environment that I'm going to be talking to you about is the Utah rangelands and how are people living along the Wasatch Front affected. And we have our cattle, obviously, on our Utah rangelands, and I want to talk to you about the way we use cattle to improve rangeland and how it impacts wildlife, and from that perspective. Early in my career, I was not a fan of livestock grazing. I was afraid that we were harming the land. I didn't quite understand rotational grazing, but once I started studying it, and learned the positive impacts from it, I changed my point of view. Let me see. Yeah, so I now believe that science-based rotational grazing improves range health and benefits wildlife. Others have changed their viewpoints as well. Christopher McKellar, an environmental activist at Sierra Club and Grand Canyon Trust, is quoted as saying, he used to know that cattle were the worst evil on the face of the public land. I've since learned that cattle in the hands of people who know how to use them can be wonderful tools to restore the health of public land. And Dan Daggett, environmental activist with Earth First and the Sierra Club, one of the things I used to support was the premise that humans didn't belong in the ecosystem, that we were somehow separate from it, and we called that natural. Let me show you some before and after shots of areas on desert land and livestock to show you quite dramatically how grazing has improved the quality of the habitat. The shot on the left was in 1984. This is Saluratus Creek and Saluratus Canyon on desert land and livestock. And the same area was shot again in 2011. And you can see the dramatic difference in the habitat, how it has been improved, the watershed protected. Here's another shot on Deseret Ranch before and after, 1920 on the left, 2011 on the right. And again, these rangelands were improved of modern grazing techniques. Now, I'm a wildlife advocate, and I focus on bird life. And getting people interested in wildlife through a focus on birds. And I enjoy taking people out into the wilds of Utah to introduce them to that. And I have found the best place to take birders when they come to visit our state is to take them to desert land and livestock. It's a working cattle ranch, and it is the best place I know of in Utah to show them tremendous diversity in the habitat and in the wildlife. This is an aerial shot of that area. Bear Lake is at the top of the map. This area down here is Evanston, and this area in here is essentially the desert land, about 205,000 deeded acres, as Bill mentioned. And I have a birding lease on the ranch. My nature company is called Wild About Birds Nature Center, and we just love to take people up there. And I tell people typically in a day on Deseret Ranch, we'll see over 100 bird species in a single day. It's that diverse. We have 451 bird species that use Utah rangelands. And we have two particular birds that have created global important bird areas on Deseret Ranch because of their presence. The one on the top left is the long-billed curlew, and the one on the bottom right, the greater sage grouse. The world population of sage grouse is estimated to be 150,000. About 600 males live on Deseret Ranch, about 2,000 sage grouse in total, which gives it that global important bird area designation. And the long-billed curlew, there are about 20,000, and we have about 20 nesting pair on Deseret Ranch. Again, that creates that global important bird area designation, as well as the other diversity that occurs there. Of the 451 bird species that use Utah, 62% of all of them can be found on the ranch at different times of the year. and 38% nest on the ranch, which is, you know, quite amazing when you think of one place to have that much diversity. Here's an example of some of the raptors alone that use the ranch, and to have that many diversified raptors in one area gives you an idea how the prey base, the multiplicity of the prey base exists. Golden eagle, peregrine falcon, northern kestrel, northern marsh hawk or harrier, Frusian's hawk, Swainson's hawk, all nest on the ranch. We manipulate the land there, the ranch does, to create this diversity. Areas that are treated in a variety of ways. Here you see mechanical treatments. And it creates these mosaics of cover, these edge effects that are really important for wildlife, particularly sage grouse and brood types of critters like that. The insect population is attracted to these areas, and the diversity of the understory, the wildflowers, the forbs, and the grasses are quite complex and creates a very viable ecosystem. As well as the host of other wildlife that lives on the ranch along with the domestic stock, you know, moose, elk, deer, beaver, and so forth. Just a small smattering of what you'll find there. Now, why are all these animals and birds present in this area? It's this abundant food source that has been created through this rotational grazing system that's utilized on the ranch itself to create such wonderful diversity. The ranchers call this rotational grazing the modern techniques, and Bill Hopkin, who was the manager of the ranch, will talk to us now and take us through the actual details of Deseret's program. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So this map shows you where Deseret Land and Livestock is in location of the state of Utah, right along the Wyoming border. And I think that most of the folks who are familiar with Deseret would agree that the key to the economic and ecologic success on the ranch is the 30 years of time-controlled grazing. A number of years ago, we asked a group of range professionals and grazing experts to team up and get together and provide us with the 2 or 3 very most important principles, grazing principles, that if they were applied to the resources, the rangelands of Utah, would improve the health of the range. It was kind of interesting that the first thing that they said was that most rangeland in Utah isn't overstocked, but grazing is often undermanaged. And this first bullet point is the key. Grazing impacts are managed by controlling the time or how long animals are within a specific pasture or in a specific area, and then timing or the season of use. The interaction between those two things is huge. Intensity of grazing, or how much they remove while they're there, is also very important. Even if you do that, these resources are continually changing over time. They may be moving more toward woody species. And so this group of technical experts suggested that we also need to pay attention to succession and managing succession, or improved diversity adds to the sustainability. I hope that this map will help demonstrate what the technical committee was talking about in a memorable way. This is actually a map of Deseret, and it is a grazing plan for 1 year. As Bill mentioned, this is a high elevation country. The lowest part of the range is 6,300 feet, and the highest is about 8,600 feet. Very harsh climate, about a 52-day frost-free growing season. Lower part of the ranch gets about 9 inches of precip, moves up to 15 or so, and then up at the very highest, about 30 inches. You can see that there are incredible number of pastures on the ranch, and that is the key to the time control grazing. So let's just take, for example, this kind of mauve-colored group of pastures. This is about 20 pastures for one herd of about 1,450 cow-calf pairs from the 1st of April until about Thanksgiving time. So if they start out here in Dry Lake on April 1, and they spend 5 or 6 days, then go to Dixon Hole, and then to Sessions, maybe during April. And then they move to this pasture, this one, and so forth during May, and then on to these other pastures during June or July, and then move further on, and then they wrap up the season on the south end of the ranch. So now think about what that means. So when were they here? 1st of April. What do you think that pasture looked like the 1st of June? If they were in here the 10th of July, and there happened to just be a rainstorm, what do you think that pasture looked like in August? So it makes a huge difference for the opportunity for wildlife, because over that 205,000 acre landscape, you basically are providing the opportunity for nutrition for other species, for wildlife species, and that's the key. So if you look also, here's another herd of about 1,400 cows in the green. And because we're concentrating those animals using pastures in successional order, look how many we can totally rest for that year. And those totally rested pastures provide tall, unused forage that is perfect for early next spring in April, when the animals sow changes in season of use. That's how that all works. One other important point to make on that is that if this were public land, think about it from a recreational standpoint. So you go camping out on this landscape in June, you have the choice to be behind the cows with new regrowed green, or if you want to be where there hasn't been any cattle, you could choose a location to camp that is ahead of where the cattle have been for that year, or is a totally rested pasture. Okay, so let's talk about the specifics of what time control management really does. First, it provides rest for recovery. It reduces rebiting of individual plants, which is what overgrazing really is. In other words, cattle are moved so frequently that the grass doesn't have time to be bitten off, regrown, and be bitten off again, drawing on those root reserves and weakening the health of the plant. It decreases selectivity, and this is kind of a magical thing, where you confine animals into a smaller area and they tend to no longer eat the best and leave the rest. They tend to eat those less palatable species, giving those that are palatable an opportunity to compete for nutrients and water. And it maintains or increases diversity of plant growth forms because of that. Simply, it gives those palatable species an opportunity to compete. It increases opportunity for seed production. So on Deseret, probably 70% of that total landscape has an opportunity to produce seed annually. Now that will depend on the precipitation of that year, but over a 30-year period, you could probably safely say that 70% of those pastures, on average, produce seed during that year. It increases herbaceous plant density and cover. And this is the critical element right here, and the key to success, is having the ground covered up with plants so that when moisture comes, you capture it. It's a geometric progression, in essence, because the more moisture you capture and get in the ground, the more production you have, and it just keeps getting better year after year. On the uplands, it takes quite a long time. In the riparian zone, as you can see here, it can happen quite quickly. It allows greater management flexibility, as you can guess, where you have the opportunity to rest that many pastures. If it's a drought year, you can use some of those without hurting the health of the plants. Or if you need to do treatments, the second bullet point of the technical committee, to set back succession, you have the opportunity then to rest for 2 years, and it increases wildlife abundance and diversity. Now, this isn't magic. It's occurred for years and years. We had 500 bison for a number of years, and I learned a lot from those critters. They're a herd animal. They tend to run together as a group, but, you know, on the plains, they were moved by predators. And also, I believe, in locations like Deseret, they were moved to high elevation in the summer by biting insects. But today, we do that with cattle, or with cowboys. Now, these are the results. And I want to pay particular attention to this. This is the stocking rate change from 1983 to 2001. The mother cow numbers, pairs, went from 2,600 to 5,500. Yearling cattle increased. Elk went from 1,500 to 2,400. In 1983, 70% of the mule deer winter killed. Some of you remember that winter, and the ranch and the DWR determined that they ought to hold that population to about 3,500, more congruent with the winter capacity. Antelope walked over the fence during that winter and have increased in numbers, and moose. But maybe the most important from an indicator of resource health is what Bill Funnemore's been talking to you about, and that's birds. Birds can be anywhere they want to be, and yet here's a cattle ranch that's one of the favorite locations for birders because they can see more species in one day than almost anywhere else in Utah. And as Bill has mentioned to you, we think that's because of the grazing. Sage grouse, there were 120 males attending the original 11 leks that we knew about in 1983, and by 2001, that had increased fivefold. So this picture kind of indicates what things looked like years ago. This is taken in 1920 out by the shearing corral. This is that same pitch, same location in 2011. We haven't always done things the way we ought to. And we need to change. We need to improve. But basically, same stocking rate. It's just simply management, like the technical committee talked about. So there's a relationship between well-managed livestock grazing, healthy watersheds, diverse and abundant wildlife populations. Besides cattle ranching, livestock grazing has other applications as well. The Utah Division of Wildlife Resources uses livestock grazing to manage habitat that supports deer and elk. And the DWR's Scott McFarland, he's here with us today, so you'll have a chance to ask him some questions if you want to. Put together this brief video that we'll show you now.
Where we're at is we're on our Hennifer Echo Wildlife Management area here, and on this side of the fence to my right here is a site that's been very lightly grazed, probably undergrazed. And what we're looking at is dead and dying sagebrush. We've got a grass-dominated community. There's very little diversity into it. We have, it's probably been underutilized. And the sagebrush is showing that. If you look at this side of the fence over here, it's had been under more of an intensive grazing regime. They've utilized the grass. The sagebrush looks healthier. We've got more of a plant diversity there. It's beneficial for wildlife. It's beneficial for livestock, both. And that's the contrast, I think, that we're looking at between probably undergrazing and proper, more intensive grazing. There's been a diversion in the past to grazing, and I think that slowly that people are coming around and seeing the benefits of grazing and how we can utilize it to our benefit for multiple use on the land, where we can have livestock, we can have wildlife, we can have all the bird species, we can have everything that we can have it all if we use correct grazing practices. Grazing is critical for the health of the land. And if it's done properly, we can enhance, we can maintain our habitats for the benefit of everything. Overgrazing, on the other hand, too, is not healthy for it, because what we do is get a bunch of invasive species coming in, and it's actually a detriment to the land. So there's a balance, you know, between over and under grazing, because both of those can be detrimental for wildlife, for livestock, for everything, and for the health of the land. Well, our philosophy is we'd like to use livestock to manipulate or maintain our winter ranges and our summer ranges, to maintain that to the best use for wildlife, for the best use of wildlife.
There's another aspect to this. Some of the conservation groups have been using grazing to manage invasive species, and this is a short video.
I'm Chris Brown, Director of Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy of Utah. Where you're at today is the Great Salt Lake Shorelands Preserve in western Davis County. As an environmental group, you wouldn't expect that we would use cattle to our benefit, but we have. On this preserve in particular, we've used livestock grazing as a very effective tool to manage our land and create wildlife diversity while increasing the health and viability of the land. Since we've introduced livestock as a tool in grazing here on the preserve, noxious weed numbers have come down significantly. We used to spend a lot of time and a lot of money spraying noxious weeds, in particular perennial pepperweed. Since we've used livestock out on the preserve, very little pepperweed. It saves us a lot of money and time. We don't have to spray near as much. We also use them in our wetland areas as an effective tool to help us combat our Phragmites problem. Phragmites is an ever-increasing issue on the Great Salt Lake. It's increasing, it's encroaching in all our native stands of vegetation. And the cattle actually we're finding are keying in on that Phragmites and grazing it almost specifically. And it's providing them with a lot of protein, and the cattle will seek that Phragmites out and graze it. So this is a prime example where cattle have really been beneficial to us to manage our lands, help us with non-native species, and increase plant and animal diversity within the area. In the past, grazing, I think, was viewed by a lot of the environmental community as kind of a taboo subject, something you didn't do. You know, it was buy the land, leave it alone, and just let nature take its course. But what we're finding here is most of our landscapes developed under some sort of grazing system, whether it was bison or big game animals or whatever, or fire. And so now that we've removed all those, what we're finding with a lot of our habitats is a lot of the habitat was becoming very monotypical. We were losing diversity, you know, encroachment of noxious weeds. And so now everyone kind of along the Wasatch Front here and a lot of these other preserves and state waterfowl management areas are now using grazing as an effective tool to help manage our land. We're finding that our land's healthier, our bird species and wildlife species are more diverse. The noxious weed problems are less than they were before, and overall our ecosystems are healthier having livestock as a part of this system.
Right, as Bill said, my name is Paul Jackas. I'm in the Department of Applied Economics here at Utah State University. And before talking about the economics of time-controlled grazing, what I'd like to do first is talk about the agricultural economy here in the state of Utah. Now, in 2011, the year for which we have the most recent information, cash receipts were about $1.6 billion for agricultural producers, of which about 2/3 came from livestock products. Now, livestock products are composed of a lot of different categories, but just under half of that came from essentially grazing of public and private lands, where these animals spend at least some time out on the pasture. So we're talking about cattle and calves and sheep and lambs. What this means then is that agricultural production by livestock animals that are grazing out there account for about 1/3 of cash receipts to Utah farmers and ranchers. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, agriculture itself is actually not, production agriculture is not a very big portion of the Utah economy. And you would be right. It's about, by value added, it's about 1% of our $125 billion economy. But let's take a closer look at that. In rural areas, production agriculture is a huge portion of the economy. In Beaver County, as measured by value added, production agriculture accounts for 20% of the $250 million economy they've got there. Wayne County, that's about 15%. Rich County is about 15%. Let's put that in perspective. Think about the state economy, $125 billion. An equivalent proportion of the state economy would include all construction and all manufacturing in the state. If we want to have a healthy state economy, we basically need to have health in those two sectors of the economy. What this means for rural portions of the state is that what we need is a healthy and vibrant agricultural economy. Now, let's turn to time-controlled grazing, which turns out can be a win-win for not just ranchers and for wildlife enthusiasts, but it also means a win for the economy as well. As Bill Hopkin mentioned, time-controlled grazing can allow us to increase the stocking rate, and it can lengthen the time spent on the range. What this means is we've got a greater value of our product, and we've got greater ranch income. In addition, we're improving wildlife habitat and we're improving water quality. This helps hunters, anglers, and wildlife enthusiasts as well. So, I was part of a team that took a look at the 143,000 acre allotment up in Rich County called Three Creeks. And under 2009 production practices, what we saw was that we could have about 3,200 cattle out there and about 500 sheep. What did that mean? Well, that meant we generated about $3 million in output. We had about 25 full and part-time jobs in addition to the jobs that were provided by the rancher and the ranch family, and with about $500,000 in income out there. We then took a look at what would happen if we went out and engaged in time-control grazing. So what does that mean? A rancher's got to go out there and they have to invest in fencing. They've got to get piping to bring water across the pastures. They've got to hire ranch hands to help keep the cattle moving. So you've got these added expenses, but you also have the added value of the forage that's out there. What did we see? We saw that if we increased the stocking rate by 10% and lengthened the season by 1 month, what we would see would be a 9% increase in the value of output, we'd see an 8% increase in employment, and we'd see a whopping 47% increase in income. What's going on here? The rancher is able to substitute relatively inexpensive forage on high-quality range for relatively expensive feed that they would have to purchase on the market. So this ends up showing that, wow, we can actually, this is actually very important to ranchers if they can end up doing this, okay? There's also these non-market benefits. And just as an aside, this is why I became an economist. I was very interested in non-market values. As a backpacker, as a rock climber, I knew that these activities on public lands had value, yet they're not traded in the market. They didn't have a price. Some people would say the benefits were intangible. Well, there had to be a way to measure them, and that's what actually brought me into economics. Well, as it turns out, recreation economics has been going on for a very long time, and we've synthesized a literature of about 2,000 studies of non-market values of recreation out there. And big game hunting is worth or generates a net economic value of about $95 a day. Freshwater fishing, about $69 a day. Wildlife viewing, this is the birding that Bill Fenimore was talking about, is worth or generates a value of about $92 a day. So, an economist looks at this and says, okay, if we have time-controlled grazing, how much more are we going to get in terms of recreational trips, in terms of recreation activity in this area? Now, unfortunately, we're unable to estimate that for the Three Creeks allotment, but just think about this. If, in fact, we get 1,000 more days of birding out there, that means we're going to generate about another $92,000 in economic value. So time-controlled grazing yields economic benefits through the market, and it actually generates non-market economic values as well. It really ends up being that proverbial win-win. So to summarize, agricultural production ends up being a very important and vital component of rural economies. About half of Utah's livestock production value depends on grazing on public and private lands. So it would be important for us to actually make sure we're doing that in the best way possible. And then finally, time-controlled grazing can benefit ranchers, it can benefit wildlife enthusiasts, and it can benefit local economies. So I'd like to turn it back over to Bill Hopkin one more time.
Thank you. There's one other issue that we should mention, and that relates to fire. I believe that time control grazing can have a dramatic impact on the size of fires. As you're well aware, in the Intermountain West, over the last few years, we've had huge catastrophic fires. While I don't know that we can document this with science, but could that be related to the 4-fold decrease in livestock grazing since 1940? Quite possibly. You look at this picture and think, wow, magically, a barbed wire fence stopped that fire. But the reality is that on the right-hand side had been grazed. The fire came down. When it got to the fence, the fine fuel was missing, so it would not carry the fire. So the sage grouse habitat in this sagebrush was preserved. Come on out, guys. I hope that what we've showed you today is sustainable methods of improving the condition of our public and private lands.
And grazing, when done properly, improves wildlife habitat.
And it can strengthen the economy.